I'm Aura, and I'm the host of Collective Mind, and I'm here to talk about trauma. To be clear, I won't be talking about our personal trauma. We, at least for now, are not talking about that publicly. But I am going to talk about what trauma is and some of the misconceptions that are out there that I often see invalidating certain types of trauma. So essentially, I'm here to validate all of your trauma. The American Psychological Association defines trauma as any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. Traumatic events include those caused by human behavior as well as by nature. So the big thing to keep in mind about trauma is it is not defined by how objectively bad the event itself was. It's defined by how clinically significant your brain and body's response to that event is, and how long-lasting it is, and those things. So any event that traumatizes you is traumatic, period. An analogy that our therapist recently used to help explain some of the ways that trauma actually works as compared to what people sometimes seem to think is adding salt to a glass of water or a bottle of water or whatever container of water. If you dump several handfuls of salt in it once, of course that's undrinkable, right? But if you then are in a situation where you can process that event immediately, you might be able to dump out that cup full of salt water and have just a little bit of salt left on the sides when you pour in fresh water. However, if you have that same container that starts with pure water and you're adding a little pinch of salt at a time, but you are never able to process that, and you're never dumping it out and you're never getting fresh water, that does reach a point where it's undrinkable. One of the things that analogy highlights is that the key factor is often not how objectively bad the event or events were. It's whether or not you were able to process it, and when and how safe you felt afterward. So if you go through something horrible, but you then have safe people around you who you feel safe with, and you are able to process and talk through that event in a safe, comfortable way, you might not have long-lasting trauma from that. You still might, but you might not. Whereas if you consistently are unable to process any of the things that happen that are potentially traumatic in your life, that adds up. Those things that make you feel not safe enough to process also essentially lower your threshold for being able to tolerate future trauma. So you potentially at least become less and less able to process future trauma over time if you're not less able to tolerate it and less able to process it if you're not processing it in the meantime. So with that in mind, here are some examples of things adding up in a way that might not at first seem particularly traumatic. If you are in a situation where you feel consistently even a little bit unsafe, so you're uneasy around the people you are normally around all the time. You never feel totally safe and comfortable with them. That adds up. Anything that happens, you probably won't feel safe enough to talk through it with them, to process it with them. And processing is vulnerable. It's very vulnerable. So you, to some extent, kind of have to feel safe to be able to effectively process trauma. So if you're still in that environment, whatever it is, it's very difficult to do that and often not safe to do that. And your brain knows that, so it won't. You stay in that trauma survival mode. Another example of it adding up is if the level of safe that you are, or the level of safe that you feel even, being unpredictable. So if you have someone important in your life, and sometimes when you go up to them crying, they'll give you a hug and comfort you, and sometimes they'll snap at you and seem annoyed, and sometimes they just won't react at all, and what you're doing is the same, and you don't know which reaction you're going to get from them. You get to a point where your brain just kind of defaults to assuming the least safe option is a big enough possibility that it's not worth the risk. So it's not safe to process with them, even if it just might not be safe that time, because there's no way for you to control whether or not it will be safe that time. One of the other big things that can have a really strong effect on your ability to process is if you believe that whatever happened was your fault, because then you might believe that you don't deserve to process it or to feel better, even if you have the opportunity to. I have also made an incomplete list of just some of the things that came to mind while I was preparing for this video, of types of trauma that we often see being minimized as compared to other trauma that is more regularly accepted as, well, yeah, obviously that was traumatic. For some reason, neglect gets minimized a lot, which I really don't understand. Like, generally speaking, trauma comparisons are unhelpful and don't really mean anything, because the thing that is the most traumatic to me is probably not the thing that is the most traumatic to you. And it depends on so many tiny details about your overall life experiences and the way that your brain and body work and the people in your life around you, and just so many factors that it's hard to compare. But like, neglect is very traumatic. And the number of situations where we see it just kind of assumed that, like, you should have been able to take care of yourself and at least no one was actually hurting you, or weird things like that. Neglect is very often situations where you are not able to fill those needs yourself because of all kinds of situations, but particularly in childhood, because you are not physically, mentally, emotionally, or in many cases legally capable of doing those things for yourself. And neglect can be very extreme. So it's not a lesser type of trauma, and it's certainly enough to badly traumatize someone. It should be taken seriously, is basically my point. We also see emotional and psychological trauma and abuse taken less seriously because it's not physical. I think it's in a similar way that sometimes mental health gets taken less seriously than physical health. And there are types of more physical trauma and abuse that are more extreme than some types of emotional and psychological, just like there are physical health situations that are more extreme and more deadly and all of those things than some types of mental health. It's not like a fair comparison, obviously, but there are very extreme types of emotional and psychological abuse and trauma, and in some ways it just kind of directly targets the way trauma forms, because it's targeting your brain. So it's almost more direct in a weird way, and it can be very extreme. I can feel Jaden around, so I added them because I think they're influencing my word choice and potentially my voice and stuff somewhat. Another example would be religious trauma. Religion in some contexts is very good for the people involved. It can help people a lot. In other contexts, it is intentionally weaponized, and there are areas in between. So there are areas where it can still be harmful without being intentionally weaponized. But on the extreme end, when it's intentionally weaponized, it is very horrible and is not like a normal or okay or mild experience. Medical and health trauma would be another example, which includes mental illness. You can be traumatized by your own experience of physical and or mental illness because it is distressing and difficult to function generally. And an argument that I've seen made before on the internet is that the brain can't traumatize itself, which I don't really understand what that argument is based on, but at least to me it seems ludicrous, and I have had this conversation with my therapist too, and he agrees that the brain can absolutely traumatize itself. And to put it in terms that might help make more sense, essentially, is something I do a lot, which is to transfer the concept over to physical instead of mental, because that often clicks easier. But the body can physically traumatize itself. The body can injure itself. So, of course, the brain can injure itself, you know? So, people can hurt themselves in a lot of different types of ways, but like the brain's own internal experiences can also be traumatic. So like intrusive thoughts, as an example, it can be traumatic, or just general symptoms of mental illness, like depression symptoms could be traumatic for you. And it will depend, again, on your whole context of your whole life and which things are easier or harder for you. But these types of things can absolutely be traumatic. Same with grief or loss, generally, which doesn't have to be like some of the immediate go-to things that probably come to mind, of like death of a loved one, for instance, of someone who was really close to you. It can be grieving time that was lost, generally, or like, for instance, if you become disabled, there's a grieving process of things you're not able to do anymore. Things like that. There are a lot of types of grief. Social trauma is another good example, which this in some ways falls into the category of things that people say can't be traumatic because of how common they are, because of how like normal of life experiences they are. But normal life experiences can be traumatic. Like, again, to put it in physical terms, car accidents are also pretty common and normal. They happen all the time. But you can obviously get injured in a car accident. So even normal everyday experiences can hurt you and can add up. Same with things like abandonment. Even normal types of social abandonment. Bullying, poverty. Secondhand trauma is something that I think is starting to get discussed more, but it can be traumatic to hear detailed descriptions of someone else's trauma, particularly if those descriptions are triggering for you, but it doesn't have to be, and also particularly if you feel close to that person, because it's hard to watch someone you care about get hurt like that. And hearing detailed descriptions of it has a lot of overlap with watching or otherwise experiencing it. So that can absolutely be traumatic. Something that I don't think I've seen discussed before is that it can be traumatic if you are waiting for or expecting something bad to happen and it doesn't. Just the experience of, for whatever reason, you are certain that that thing is going to happen, or you think it's really likely that it's going to happen. That is very stressful, and that can be inherently traumatic, even though nothing happened. Because something did. You were very stressed because you were so sure that that thing was going to happen. Maybe you were imagining the thing that you thought was going to happen in vivid detail. Especially if you have any comparable experiences. You might be having flashbacks of similar experiences that whole time. If you're in public when you're expecting something's going to happen, you might be trying to act normal while you're panicking or expecting that. There's just a long list of things. You can be traumatized by media, even though it didn't, physically happen to you, in a similar way that emotional and psychological trauma is also very real trauma. And same with secondhand. If you watch something terrifying, that might traumatize you. If you start having a flashback or get triggered at the perfectly wrong moment, that might become re-traumatizing because it doesn't feel safe to have that flashback in that moment. You can also be traumatized by things you consented to. It doesn't have to be forced, and there can be trauma reasons that you consent to something in the moment because that feels safer. Or you might realize during or after that you're no longer okay with it, but don't tell them to stop. That's still trauma. I kind of mentioned this earlier in the context of the brain traumatizing itself, but self-inflicted trauma is also very real trauma. Same with inner world trauma. Alters, at least in a lot of systems, can very thoroughly interact with each other in the inner world, and they can absolutely traumatize each other. Depending on how your inner world functions, there might even be ways that they can traumatize each other that wouldn't be able to happen in this external physical world. Like, we have magic in our inner world, so we can use magic to hurt each other in our inner world, and that wouldn't happen out here. Whether or not you remember the trauma, or you remember it vividly, or you remember pieces of it, or you remember how it felt but nothing else, any amount of memory or lack of memory is valid, because trauma and memory is weird. Something might not seem bad in the moment, and then with hindsight you realize that it was probably different than what you assumed in the moment, and with hindsight you realize that it wasn't okay and you become traumatized by it. I mentioned this earlier, but normal things that are common and expected and everybody experiences, that can also be traumatic. There are a lot of very, very, very common types of trauma, and that doesn't make it hurt less. Good things or necessary things can also traumatize you. So, using medical trauma as an example, even if everything was being done ethically and you consented to everything and they did everything they were supposed to, it can still be an extremely stressful experience to receive medical treatment. So that could be a very good thing that you got that treatment, but it still traumatized you, and that's also completely valid. Something I want to make absolutely sure that I highlight is that people are very different, and something that would be awesome for you could be traumatic for me. I'd like to compare things like that to physical allergies. So if I'm, for instance, really sensitive to loud noises, they startle me and overwhelm me over time. Something like fireworks could be very overwhelming. And if there are other components of I said I didn't want to go see fireworks, but I was forced to anyway, or pressured to anyway, or I felt like I was supposed to and I didn't even ask not to go, or self-judgment and shame type things of I'm supposed to like this, so why don't I want to go, and then just kind of suffering through it the whole time. And I want to make very clear that situations like this aren't personal weaknesses. So it's not that I'm weaker than you, so I got traumatized by something that wouldn't bother you. It's that people and contexts and situations are different and very complex, and my reaction to something is going to be different in some way than yours, period. And in the same way that an allergy isn't a weakness. If my brain and body have a reaction to something that yours wouldn't react to, that's not within my control. The other thing I want to make very clear is that validating other people's trauma doesn't minimize or invalidate or make light of your trauma, even if it's very different. So if I have trauma of something that seems really small and insignificant to you, I'm not making fun of you or your trauma or the idea of trauma. And there are people who do that, to be clear. Like, it's different when people are intentionally making light of trauma. But if someone is genuinely communicating that something was traumatic for them, and it seems small and insignificant to you, that's not inherently making fun of you or your trauma or the idea of trauma generally, or how hard that is. It might be just as hard for them as it is for you, even if the event itself seems objectively much smaller. What is too much will depend on the person and the context, and it's still a handful of salt whether you get it all at once or 1 grain at a time. And if you were traumatized by it, it was real trauma, period. I hope this video is helpful to some of you and validating and encouraging and anything else like that. I think this is an important thing for a lot of people, and I think it's something a lot of people don't understand. I'll put some other videos up on the screen for you to watch if you're interested. We have a lot of videos about DID generally, although this wasn't specifically about DID. This was a little bit harder to film than I expected. But I'll put some other videos on the screen that you can watch if you want. Please subscribe and ring the bell and like the video if you liked it. Helps us a lot and is a great way to support our channel. We are really excited that we're growing so much. We really like doing this, and we would love to be able to continue doing it for a long time. So thank you so much to people who are watching and subscribed and all of those things. Comment if you have any thoughts or questions or other things that you want us to talk about. You can also do those things on Discord, which is linked in the description box as always. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!